Capitalism is one of the most critical economic theories in the Western world, as it serves as much of the economic framework of many industrialized nations. Now, it's important to understand what exactly it is, how it works, and what many of its components and implications are. So let's get straight into it. Basically, in its most definitive form, capitalism is the idea that all wealth is competed for amongst private individuals, businesses, or enterprises within a free market, or any part of an industry that is open towards competition and business engagement. Basically, the way that capitalism works fundamentally is that wealth is not guaranteed in any sector of the population, but it has to be earned by employers, employees, or any participant in a particular industry by selling as much as they can towards the consumer population, or the people who wish to purchase the good or service. Now, let's go to a very basic, ambiguous example, very uncreative example. Let's say Town A, for instance. In Town A, let's say that there are 5 gas stations. Now, these 5 gas stations want to extract as much wealth as possible. They want to basically get as much money as possible by catering towards the consumer class in that town who is likely to purchase gasoline. So what they might do is they might have a premium sale day, they might invest in the appearance of their business, they might have nice stainless glass, they might have premium oil, they might, paint their gasoline shop in a very nice fashion. It's appealing towards many people in the town, and many other measures to increase the likelihood that a consumer will purchase from their gasoline station, because their intent is to make sure they have the biggest piece, the biggest share of that gasoline market in the gasoline industry of Town A. They want to sell as much gasoline as possible and be the biggest provider of gasoline in the town. They want the most consumers to purchase their goods from their gasoline station. Now, this brings into account one of the most important and critical aspects of not only capitalism, but many other economic theories, called supply and demand. And the idea of the supply and demand paradigm is that there's the supply, which is the actual good or service being produced and attempting to be sold, and there's the demand, which is the desire by the consumer class to purchase that particular good or service. And in capitalism, there's a notion called the invisible hand. And the invisible hand is the idea that the market has to achieve a balance or equilibrium between the supply and demand paradigm. There has to be high demand and high supply for the market to thrive, for prices to be at their best, for employment to be at its best, and for the entire system to flow properly. So basically, for example, let's say that in Town A, one of those gas stations we were talking about decides they're going to increase their gasoline prices by 500%. Let's say they're a very greedy business. They want as much money as possible that they can extract from the consumers. They're going to jack up their prices by 500%. Now let's say they're going to take it a step even further, and they're going to cut their wages to their workers to, let's say, 1 cent an hour. A completely inhumane, unlivable wage in the Western world. 1 cent an hour. Now, according to the invisible hand, what'll happen is that another business, a competing gas station in Town A, will take advantage of that decision, and they'll decide, guess what? I know how I can get the consumers of gas station A, or of that previous gas station, and I know maybe even how I can get some of their good workers to come work for me, and I can thrive and get a bigger share of the market than them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my prices even lower so that I basically can cater to a greater amount of consumers who probably for the most part are pretty dissatisfied with the previous gas station's decision to jack up prices that high. And then on top of that, let's say I might increase wages for workers in my business so that I can attract more workers and more applications than the previous gas station. Now, according to the invisible hand, the previous gas station that increased their prices so tremendously and cut their wages so tremendously would probably not survive very long, because the consumers would immediately shift towards another company, another share of that industry that has a more reasonable price. All of this, all the aspects of this economic system of capitalism revolve around a specific person in a specific time in history. Since the beginning of modern civilization, there have been forms or elements of capitalism in existence. As we can go back to the ancient Sumerians, and even to the medieval times, and to the 1600s, a little more recent in times, when basically there were companies and individuals and people having a free exchange of goods, such as in the late 1600s, the East India Company, which tried to sell massive amounts of tea and other forms of capital within a market. But the reason why capitalism became so significant in the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries is because of a man named Adam Smith, who in around 1776 published a novel called The Wealth of Nations, in which he discussed the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, which really is today modern capitalism. And the idea is that the market should not just be a market, it should be a free market. What that means is that fundamentally, the market should not be controlled, approved, or sanctioned by any higher authority, most notably the government or the state. What the idea of laissez-faire capitalism is that the only thing that determines what a market is, what industries exist, and what companies exist is the pure demand of the consumer class, and how companies and employers can best cater to the demands of the consumer population. And his idea of capitalism really took off. And today, we have many different theorists on capitalism that really apply toward its significance. Another very prominent philosopher within capitalism, and an idea called classical liberalism, which is a political element revolving around increased capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism, which is the idea that there should be limited government control and individual free will should be the governor of economic success in the economic system. Another theorist on that front, named David Ricardo, in the mid-1800s proposed a very relevant theory called value theory. And while there are many different axioms related to this idea, the core part of it is that the price of a particular good or service is not only dependent upon what the employer chooses, but what it's actually worth based off of other factors, like the production of that good, the wage you have to pay the employees who help manufacture that good or service, and many other factors. So, for example, David Ricardo might have argued that, let's say you're trying to sell a cheeseburger, for instance, at McDonald's or any other company. What value theory means is that the employer can't just choose, oh, okay, 99 cents sounds like a good price for a burger. That's what the consumers are asking for. Let's just sell it like that. The price is not only what the employer and the consumer wants, but it's based off of the actual factors that go into the production of that good or service. So, for example, let's say the bread of that burger, or the meat of that burger, or the refrigeration of that burger, or the salary you have to pay the chef or the cook who cooks that burger. All of that plays into the amount of money that the product or service costs, because you have to make sure that the employer, the business, has to make sure that it not only gets money from the product, but that it gets enough money to survive, to pay for all those flat costs that are involved in the creation of that good or service, in this case, the burger, besides just trying to sell it. Now, in addition to that, they should also, if they want to survive and be a business, add an amount to that price that they take for themselves called a profit. And this is essential because it's what actually builds the business, how the employer and the businessman actually gains wealth themselves. And it's critical because it also determines how much consumers may purchase. As I talked about before with supply and demand and the invisible hand, they can't increase, theoretically speaking, of course. Different applications of this have had different results and different ideas and applications. But in theory, if you increase that profit margin or the amount of the price that is for your profit, for the employer's profit, that's not meant to cover production costs, if that goes too high, then another company can compete with that by having a lower profit margin cost. Or if it goes too low, then of course the business can't survive because the employer isn't making a profit. They can't dedicate their time to a business they're not making money from. So all this involves many different factors in capitalism and shows its relevance and why it's important to understand it. So there you go. I hope there was enough left.